Exciting, man. Exciting. All over the world, impacting so many audiences everywhere. And, you know, one of the cool things about me watching all your videos, I mean, I've been in sales for 25 years, but one of the cool things is I love people that tell great stories. And so it was amazing. I'm sitting there watching video after video after video after video because I'm like engaged in these stories.
Yes.
Because we, you know, our brains, and you were kind of talking, maybe you could talk a little bit about this, but our brains are wired to love stories. How is that?
Well, if you go back to the days when mankind lived in caves, they told stories by, you know, the fire and painted them on the walls. Now we tend to tell stories with the glow of PowerPoint presentations in conference rooms, but it is a part of the way our brain goes. If I say, let me tell you, Daniel, some stats and figures, your brain goes into analytics and left brain analysis paralysis. But if I said, you know, let me tell you a story, you automatically relax. You think, oh, there's a different part of my brain now. Maybe it'll be entertaining even. And if it's a great story, it'll be memorable so the people can repeat it to other people and become your brand ambassador. So I tell people your story should be 3 C's: clear, concise, and compelling. So we can unpack each of those if you like. Why does it need to be clear? If it's not clear, we confuse people, and we know the confused mind says no, and they're never going to tell you they're confused, right? Why does it need to be concise? Because you want it to be short enough that people can remember and repeat it. And then finally, why does it need to be compelling? It needs to make us feel something. If the stakes aren't high in the story, we don't care about what's going on, and we have to tug at some heartstrings in order to get that emotional connection that makes people want to buy from us or hire us.
Yeah, beautiful. And so tell me about your story. I mean, I want to know a little bit about where you came from. Where were you born? I mean,
oh gosh,
were you born a rich? Were you born a rich kid, a poor kid, middle-class kid? Were you a good boy or a bad boy? I want to know your compelling story.
Well, I don't know how compelling it is, but my story is I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago in the Midwest, middle-class life. My dad was a carpenter. My mom was a secretary. And it was very much those values of help people, volunteer, work hard. And I knew I wanted to get into advertising. So that's what I majored in college. And I was completely fascinated by what made people change brands or change their opinion or persuade people. And it had enough show business element to it with music and sound bites and taglines to make it entertaining for me versus just hardcore business. And then I moved to San Francisco and was selling multi-million-dollar mainframe computers against IBM. And they would sell with something called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So if you as the client bought anything that wasn't IBM and it broke a lot in those days, they'd point the finger at the other vendor and say, you know, that person brought that other vendor in and you will get fired. And I went, oh, it's not about the logic. This equipment's less expensive. It's more reliable, but there's all this emotion behind still not buying something logically. So that's really when the advertising background kicked in. And then I got transferred down to LA and ended up working for an ad agency doing commercials for movies coming out on home video. If you remember that, you may not be old enough to remember Blockbuster, but that used to be on every street corner like Starbucks. And I really honed my storytelling skills there, because if a movie hadn't done well in the theaters, we could reposition that commercial to get people to want to go rent or eventually buy it. And so it's just, well, what part of that 30-second story are you telling out of the 2-hour movie? And then I had a 15-year career at Conde Nast selling advertising for brands like W Magazine and Self, and Conde Nast has big brands like Wired and GQ. And Lexus was one of my territory when I lived in LA. And they said, you know, we looked at, I don't know, 25 magazines. We picked 10 to come in and pitch back to back. And we're only going to pick 3. but do not talk about numbers because we've already analyzed that. That's why you're in the final 10. And half of the reps were deer in headlights. What? I can't talk about my circulation and my reader's income. I don't know what I'm going to talk about. So that's when I realized, oh, whoever tells the best story is the one that's going to get the sale. And then from there, I started speaking to my clients' sales teams, whether it was a car company or a fashion company. And that's what launched my speaking career.
And so when you were, can you tell me a little bit about that story? I mean, that you told Lexus that kind of
sure.
got you, like, what was it on your story versus maybe some of these other stories that got you in there where the other ones didn't?
Well, typically what you would do is you'd have a marketing idea to go with your presentation. And so that was really what the story was, that this particular idea is going to engage people emotionally, because that you always goes back to what's the client's problem or challenge. In the case of Lexus, I think it's still a challenge for them. People don't buy a Lexus emotionally. They buy a BMW for the thrill of driving, but a Lexus is like the smart, intellectual, oh, it'll be a good car kind of thing. And they wanted some emotion. So if you could come up with an idea that had some emotion and excitement to it, and they said, we'd love to target the world of art because that makes people feel something when you look at paintings and sculptures, and maybe you think of the cars, even moving art, who knows? So we came up with the idea that we would pick up 10 couples who were subscribers and had a Mercedes or BMW lease expiring in 6 months. So it was very targeted, and pick them up in a new Lexus, take them to this Golden Globes party the magazine was hosting. So it was very glamorous. And then from there, they'd go to a restaurant with a private dining room where somebody from the Museum of Modern Art would be curating the conversation. And in between courses, they could take a ride in yet another car around the block. So they gave me $500,000 worth of advertising. They sold 3 cars that night, including one. The chef himself bought one. So you never know where the sale is going to come from. So that's an example of storytelling, bringing data to life.
So I'm imagining this is a little bit different for advertising agency, for a guy coming from advertising, then goes on the big stage. And now you built an incredible career speaking all over the world. When did you know that maybe you wanted to go into that area versus just staying in the advertising business? Just like there's probably a bunch of your buddies that are still in the advertising business.
Well, I wrote my first book while I was still working at Conde Nast. And that concept of being an entrepreneur, not an entrepreneur, but was very new back then. Luckily, I had a wonderful boss, Alice Alston, who had launched Oprah's magazine. So she was very supportive when I wrote the book and said, oh, we'll throw a book party for you. And then I would go to the car advertisers and say, run your car ad in this magazine. They can afford the car. They'll put it on their short list of test drives. And as added value, the magazine would buy copies of my book. And I'm going to give your sales team a talk on how to sell to the luxury market. So the ad drives traffic to the dealerships, and then my book and talk would help close more sales. And when I started doing that, I realized, oh, I love this. And I've been in their shoes. I know what it's like to get rejected. I know what it's like to have pressure to hit quotas. And that's what launched my speaking career.
Beautiful. And so look, we're obviously next year we're going into a political, another election, another crazy American election we're going to have, I'm sure. How does, when the politicians, because these people they're taught how to talk. They're tested and they, how does this play a part? I'm just curious from the standpoint where you come from, because you're a storyteller. And I notice a lot of politicians, they're starting to interject little stories into. Yes. So how does storytelling play a part in the political process?
Well, they get heavily coached and practice role-playing those debates so that they're not a deer in headlights. And so that translates directly to sales. I tell people, don't just go into a presentation cold. You need to practice what you're going to say. Even if you've said it 100 times, it still needs to be customized to who you're talking to. And also what I see a lot of politicians doing correctly is telling the story of one person. there was this person, he was the plumber, he had a family, he and his wife were struggling, and so that's who these policies are going to help. And the whole goal of a good story is that people see themselves in that story. And so people could remember the name of the person they were talking about. And as opposed to just talking about there's X thousands of people unemployed, or unemployment's went up or down, or whatever the numbers are, that doesn't stick. It's the story of one person's struggle and how you're going to help that one person's life get better and live the American dream and tug into the heartstrings there.
If you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. If you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.